Going to college can be a great way to improve upward mobility, but new analysis shows that enrollment and completion in higher ed for men in particular is declining. So what's causing this, and what should we do about it?
So the fact that male enrollment is down and male completion, conditional enrollment, is down is quite the puzzle and conundrum for college campuses.
On this episode, we sit down with a group of experts to discuss the male retreat from higher education, what it means for society, and how states should be approaching the issue. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking once again about upward mobility and economic opportunity, in particular for men, tying into some of the previous conversations we've had, and a growing area of focus. And to have this conversation, once again, we're joined by Beth Akers, who's a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute and a contributor here for us at Defending Ideas. Beth, welcome back.
Glad to be with you again, Nic.
But the last time we talked was we sat down with Nick Eberstadt, who wrote the book Men Without Work, and really kind of dug into this phenomenon of working age men sort of pulling back from work or looking for work, essentially just not engaging with the labor force. Now it's kind of a similar story, but in a different sphere. We're talking about higher education specifically with a couple of experts to dive into some of the data trends of men are increasingly kind of just not engaging in higher education in the same way.
That's right. I mean, you almost can't talk about labor and education separately. And so this is a bit of the predecessor of the issue that we talked about with Nick, which is just that we've got missing men in higher education. And so we've got a couple people who are true experts in this area. Mike also happens to be a Utah native, which is great. And we're going to walk through, the data about what's happening here and kind of noodle on some explanations for what's happening. And I think, like with Nick, we explore a lot in this conversation, more than we really have a lot of solutions. But I think we make some good progress here.
One of the things that stands out to me from this conversation, I'm excited to play for our listeners, is that so I sort of approach this issue as not so much like a men versus women percentages battle, kind of sometimes it's referred to as kind of an equity mindset. That's not as compelling to me as much as we want to have a sort of a broad overarching system that allows for pathways to flourishing for everybody.
Absolutely.
And kind of however things shake out, as long as we have robust pathways for everyone, that's what matters. And in this case, it seems like for men in particular, there's something about higher ed, traditional college, that they just don't see as the pathway to flourishing as much as they used to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I spent most of my career studying higher education, and a lot of times we'll say, higher education doesn't need to be for everyone. But usually when we say that, it's been in the context of, whether it matches someone's interest or not. I think we're entering this conversation of, if higher education isn't serving men in the same way that it's serving women, are there other institutions that could be better serving men? And so, that's the conversation now. It's just a really different one than the one that we've been having. But it's absolutely true that, we can have institutions that better serve men. We can have institutions that better serve women. Maybe higher education participates on both sides of that. Maybe it's, more lopsided towards women in this, vision of the future we have where everyone is well served. But you're right. The goal here is to get everyone to thrive and to be able to support themselves, support their families, and be happy. So this is a great conversation about one of the pieces in that bridge, the pathway to getting people there.
Well, with that, let's go ahead and dive into our interview with two folks actually out of the state of Tennessee to help us understand how to do exactly what you just said in the context of higher ed in particular. So let's dive right in. Joining us now in the virtual studio are two guests who are experts in kind of the world of opportunity and upward mobility, specifically looking at the vocational prospects of men, as we're going to be talking about today, of course. So very excited to welcome into our virtual studio our two guests, Mike Kofoed, who is the research assistant professor for the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. As part of the Haslam Business College. He also has a joint appointment with the Department of Economics at the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here.
And also Melinda Brock, who is the operations manager for the American Institute for Boys and Men, and also the program manager for the Higher Education Male Achievement Collaborative. Melinda, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you both for being here. And of course, we have Beth Akers with us from American Enterprise Institute, bringing her economic expertise and her role contributing to these wonderful conversations we have. So we want to continue and dive in. And really what we're talking about today is just this question of male achievement in higher ed, almost kind of borrowing the name, Melinda, of HEMAC, of that higher education collaborative that you're working on. And I really want to start off the conversation to just give our listeners a sense of the scope of what's happening. So first, can you kind of help set the stage for us of what's going on? There's a Deseret News article that we'll link to in the show notes that dives into some of this, just essentially saying that men their share of enrollment in college is declining. First, just give us a sense of the data. What is happening with men in higher education?
Yeah, thank you, Nic. And you're right. We do need to look at the data to tell the story accurately. One statistic that we always go back to is from a 2023 Pew study that says there's 1 million fewer men pursuing college now than there was in 2011. And if we look at the numbers, that is actually 2.4 million men that are not pursuing those undergrad degrees today. The 2.4 million less, than their female counterparts. There's 60% of the undergrad enrollees are female to only 40% that are men. We also see that not only are men enrolling at lower numbers, but they're falling behind in graduation as well. Black men are the lowest graduation levels of any of the races that we look at.
Can either of you get, and Mike, maybe what you've seen nationally or even in Tennessee specifically, add to what Melinda said for any kind of data points we need to know. And I'm also curious about kind of the trend. I mean, looking at point in time, the 60-40 number, how has that changed in recent years?
No, I think that's really important, especially on this issue, because when you talk to people about higher education and the intersection of higher education and gender, normally we would think about how Title IX and the desire to have more parity amongst women and men, because historically, if we go back to maybe like early 20th century, you would see the vast majority of college enrollees were male. And so then about the 50s and 60s, we have Title IX, and that's excellent because it's going to open up opportunities for women who might not have had those otherwise. And so then you reach a bit of parity, but something interesting happens about the mid-2000s coming up to today. And what happens is that you see a drop in the share of male enrollment in higher education. And so we go from about 50-50 back to about 60% female, 40% male, which interestingly enough is actually a wider gap than would have happened around the Title IX gap. And so that kind of causes us to pause and think and kind of say, well, what could be going on? I think one important part that I think sometimes we forget is that when we think about higher education, it is very tempting for us to think about like the Ivies or very elite schools, where the universe of higher education is not that. The universe of higher education is maybe like a public regional school like East Tennessee State or Weaver State University, where I did my undergraduate degree in Ogden, Utah, or a community college. And no matter how we kind of cut it on all these different levels of higher ed, we see this exact same trend line continuing, where there's a decrease in male enrollment. And this contributes, as well as you've seen some kind of in the media, talks a little bit about a loss of faith or feeling that higher education has some kind of effectiveness for labor market outcomes. And so one of the concerns that we have is that if we want to serve especially since I am at a state land grant institution, we want to serve the people of our state in Tennessee, then we need to try to serve all of those people and try to understand why it is that men seem disengaged with higher education.
I want to read a couple of stats from the Deseret News article that we'll link to kind of help further set the stage of the data. In that article, it says men now account for just 2 out of 5 college degrees earned in the United States, fewer than the share women received in 1972. Backs up what both of you are saying. The article also says less than half of men who enroll complete a 4-year degree within the expected time frame. Increasing numbers of male students arrive at college with significant mental health needs and associated challenges. So I mentioned those to again kind of help put some shape around the trend lines of what's happening. But Mike, you mentioned something that this all seemed to start in the mid 2000s. Do we have any idea why? What happened in the mid 2000s to sort of start this trend line?
Yeah, that's kind of a puzzle that we're trying to figure out, because because one of the questions we might then say is, well, if men are not going to college, then what are they doing with their time? And so one of the presentations that we worked on at the Boyd Center joint with HEMAC was trying to investigate these actual trends. And so you could say, well, maybe they are choosing to go into vocational training and doing more kind of applied technology types of jobs or skilled work types of jobs. We actually don't find that. What we find is a drop in labor force participation that's going on as well. So that could be a number of different theories or hunches that we don't quite have causal data on. And that's why I think, so sometimes people will say, well, why are you talking about it when you don't have the answer? And I think the reason why is because by talking about it, we can kind of, as a community, think about what is going on. One could be this discussion of a decline in manufacturing that's happened that used to be a very male-heavy job. Some point to trade, but we were actually seeing that a lot of those jobs are being lost to automation. But then if men are not going into those types of jobs and they're not participating in the labor force, where could they be? It could be a rise of gig economy work. It could be all these kind of informal markets that maybe we don't have the right data for. But regardless, the answer is kind of strange because we see a lot of men disengaging from multiple different facets of society.
Mike, there's this idea in economics that I think is probably not appropriate here, but it's this idea of revealed preferences. I think this is there's a kind of very naive interpretation of events sometimes that says, well, if men aren't going to college, it must be that there's not a good reason, or, they're making a choice that's in their best interest not to go. I struggle with that here. And we've talked before in earlier conversations about how, we feel like the economics is not giving us all the answers here. I wonder what your thoughts on that are, Mike. I mean, in terms of have the returns shifted for men so much that, this is reflecting a rational decision, or is there a barrier, frictions we might call it? What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's where it gets really kind of confusing. I like that term, even though it's super nerdy, revealed preference. I use it on my own children because
you are welcome.
The unfortunate part of having dad as an economist, which is don't tell me what you're going to do, show me what you're actually going to do, which is kind of what revealed preference means. I would buy that argument if we saw the returns to college education decline. And what we see, and this is why when I talk to people about returns to college, I don't want to denigrate folks that go to technical or vocational education. But what I try to show them is look at the median wage of getting a 4-year degree and getting a vocational or technical degree, and then look at the distributions, because the median and the tails, the extremes on the up and down, are going to help tell us a really important story. And what we find in the data is that a bachelor's degree for both men and women pays off on average more than a vocational degree. However, depending on major or maybe school quality that you choose for your higher education, there is potential to get a vocational degree and earn more than the lowest paid bachelor's degrees. But why this is kind of interesting when it comes to the male aspect is that men normally, where on campus do we see men disproportionately represented? It tends to be in the STEM fields, which tend to have the highest wages. So it's not necessarily that wages for college-educated men have gone down. And so that kind of causes an extra puzzle here to why then they might not want to go to college and get those extra wage gains.
Right. And I would even say, too, the theory about the shift to vocational training makes some sense, but I think some of that would still be captured in the enrollment data, since so much of vocational training is happening at community colleges. So it feels like a puzzle.
Yeah, it is quite a puzzle, because what we're seeing then is not necessarily... For that to be the truth, we would see this gigantic spike in community college, vocational training, and apprenticeships. And we don't see that necessarily. Not that those aren't great avenues for men, but we don't see them engaging in those. And so what we're seeing then is a lot of young men stuck at the high school degree only spot. And then this becomes a kind of a puzzle, like Melinda said, because if I am there, my employment and health prospects and family and marriage prospects are going to be quite limited. But if I start a bachelor's degree and I don't finish, then I kind of go back to where I started, but with that increased debt. So the fact that male enrollment is down and male completion, conditional enrollment, is down is quite the puzzle and conundrum for college campuses.
Melinda, I'm curious to how you see this from your vantage point, both at the American Institute for Boys and Men and through the Higher Education Male Achievement Collaborative. That one of the things I appreciate about the American Institute, the work you all are doing there, is that it at least the way I interpret it and the way I would kind of help champion it is it's through the lens of we want to help more men, boys, men, everywhere in between, lead flourishing lives through their vocational pursuits, educational work, through family life, through meaningful engagement in civil society. And the way I would kind of argue we apply that to this issue of post-secondary or post-high school training is college, a traditional four-year degree, can be a wonderful path. I think all of us here in this room, so to speak, have benefited from college and advanced degrees in the traditional four-year system. It's certainly been a huge blessing in my life. But we've had a lot of conversations recently about the value of skilled trades as alternatives. And to your point earlier, Mike, that when you look at the aggregate data, you also have to sort of splice into these specific details, because just because college on average pays off well doesn't mean it has to be the only path for a lot of people. And so I'm kind of looking at this through this global, like, as a society, we obviously need multiple pathways to give people maximum opportunity. But I'm curious, Melinda, what is your perspective on, the decline away from traditional four-year training to we don't know, it doesn't seem like they're filling, the gap in vocational training or trade skills or those kinds of things. Wearing your hat as like, well, we want economic thriving for men. They're not getting it at the same rates through higher ed. Doesn't look like in the data they're getting it through trades or tech schools or those kinds of things. So how do you make sense of it from your vantage point?
Yeah, I think this goes back to a story of purpose and belonging, and that young men need to know that they do have a purpose and that they are worth pursuing, whether that be at a 2-year institution who are doing some really great work for young men, or a 4-year institution that they can pursue a degree or a certificate in an area that they are interested in and be a contributing member to their family, to society, and also be more fulfilled on their own. What we're seeing is that a lot of these conversations should actually begin at the middle school, around that 8th grade age, where we're starting to talk about careers and future planning for schooling, whether that be a 2-year, 4-year, or vocational school.
I want to get a sense of, Melinda, as you're talking about kind of when we need to start having these kinds of conversations. And I guess it's the big question on my mind is when we're looking at this issue overall, the Deseret News coverage does kind of frame this as a problem. It's something that should be concerning to us. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. Is this a problem or a crisis? And to what extent is it that? And I think the answer to that hinges on what are young men doing instead of going to college? And it sounds like if we don't know for sure yet, but I'm curious to both of you, kind of your perception of the cultural aspects or the sociological aspects. Beth and I recently sat down with Nic Eberstadt, who wrote the book Men Without Work, on a previous episode of Defending Ideas. And, of course, he brings his economic prowess as well as you all do. But it was interesting. We kind of landed on this idea that, the decline of men in the workforce, and Mike, you mentioned the labor force participation rates, the decline of men just engaging in work or looking for work didn't seem to be primarily driven by economic factors. That's, Melinda, what you're saying, maybe a purpose, almost this spiritual things like, what am I needed for in society? Do you see, and Beth, chime in if there's anything from the Nic Eberstadt conversation, but I'm curious if you all see anything like that sort of helping to explain this issue.
Well, Mike, I can tee this one up for you if
Sure,
that's okay.
That's great.
We recently had a partner convening of our HUMAC partners in April, and we were really looking at the motivating factors of why a young man would choose to attend or not to attend higher ed. And we saw that this generation, unlike those before, are spending a lot of time on social media. That's no surprise to us. But the messages that they're hearing on social media are those of be your own boss, pursue your own dreams. You do not have to follow a traditional path, but you can be an entrepreneur. You can have multiple hustles and be independently wealthy. So that doesn't necessarily follow the path of their parents before them. And there were a couple of jokes of, well, does that mean that these young men are living in their parents' basements and selling crypto or online sports betting? And I'll kick it over to Mike now to answer that.
Well, I was going to say, if they're doing those things and thriving, I'm okay with that. But I have a question about whether that leads to thriving in general.
Yeah, during that discussion, it reminded me a little bit of when I was in grad school because we had 2 little boys at the time. So I tutored the University of Georgia football team for diaper cash. And when I would talk to those players, they would say, well, we're all going to the NFL. We're all going to make it big. So there's no reason to, finish school or do any of these things. And I remember one day just finally looking up the NFL statistics and bringing them to them. And they all kind of sat there and went, at a big SEC school, my probability of making the NFL is extremely small, even though that payoff is really big. And so just trying to help young people understand, like, these are the probabilities of kind of making it as an influencer or doing a side hustle, or here are those kind of wage gains over the long term. And when it comes to purpose, I think that's extremely important. I think sometimes we as economists get wrapped up in a theory model on a chalkboard or on a data set, and we forget that. I think it was Melissa Kearney once pointed out when she was talking about marriage that a government transfer isn't going to help me out as a single parent with raising children, right? Like, it'll give me some financial help, but it won't give me that emotional and important familiar support. Just like, I could maybe do government tax and transfer to fill the income need. But what happens with work is it gives us some kind of purpose. It helps us feel like that we are actually doing a certain role in society and supporting and caring for the people around us. Now, that traditionally was a kind of a male societal role. It doesn't necessarily have to be the only role for men. And also, it doesn't mean that women can't also fulfill that role. But it does mean that we probably have a lot of young men who don't feel a lot of purpose. And how can we help them do that, I think, is a big question that's going to take many multidisciplinary and different venues to try to think that through.
Melinda, it's so interesting that you raised that, that feeling that young men are having, because I have relatively few young college-age men in my life, but the couple that I do know have said things like this to me. So this is, it shouldn't be that surprising. But, just to put a fine point on it, I mean, what is the economics of that option? I mean, and how they're not shooting for the NFL, but this idea of being an entrepreneur, I mean, where is the return on that type of path?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's there. We are in a country that has a lot of support for entrepreneurship. Both Tennessee and Utah are quite similar, but unique in that they have an entrepreneur kind of culture that goes on. And that, like kind of like you said, Beth, if that means that every one of these young men is knocking it out of the park at Silicon Slopes, then we should be cheering and being excited. We don't necessarily find that. So I think one thing that we could do as universities, especially since the business school cuts my check, is helping develop our curriculum and kind of our outreach to help them see that one of the best ways to actually get on the entrepreneurial path is coming to UT Knoxville and majoring in business, right? Or at the University of Utah, helping them then see that a university education is going to fulfill that role for them. One of the things that kind of drives me a little bit nuts as an academic, and maybe this is the economist in me showing, is when we get together as academics, we say, well, we shouldn't tell students that coming to college is all about wage gains. It should be about personal development and all these kind of things. And I think we're kind of telling on ourselves a little bit. One, because the data shows there are significant wage gains. But two, I think that's what young people really want from their college education, is the opportunity to flourish and increase their career paths.
And I think to that point, Mike, this gets to, I would say there is a tension, perhaps a healthy tension, between this conversation about traditional four-year university path versus going a vocational or kind of trade school route. Because my perception, my interpretation of all these conversations is that there are large swaths of young people who went to college kind of under that promise of, hey, if you go to college, if you get a bachelor's degree, you're going to be much more successful economically, you're going to earn more money. And as you said, in aggregate, that is true, but somebody going and getting a degree in engineering versus somebody going and majoring in French, and not to pick on anything, there can be a lot of great options, but there are differentials just in the economy in terms of return on investment. I think if people say, well, I was promised this outcome if I just went and got a bachelor's degree and I did it, and if I'm not seeing that outcome, that I think creates some of this consternation. And but to the point of like, we need to broaden the conversation and also deepen the conversation. What I mean by that is broaden in that I think we do need a societal shift, that there are many potential pathways that young people, and in this case young men, can take, and the project of higher ed and K-12, Melinda, you mentioned starting in middle school in some instances, is to create a strong pathway infrastructure, but then make sure we're sort of advertising all the pathways fairly and not sort of culturally biasing in one direction, but helping people take advantage of those opportunities. And I wonder how much it ties to what both, I think, Melinda and Beth were saying about this idea of sort of the hustle economy of, well, I can be independent. I don't have to be beholden to an employer. And I'm thinking, I guess I want to ask you all to sort of take economics hats off and put on like a sociological
Oh boy, we'll
hat.
try. We'll try.
Oh,
no
no
promises.
Oh no, there are bitter enemies as economists.
But what I mean by this is we talk a lot at Sutherland Institute about the idea of institutions of civil society. We've talked with Yuval Levin before. I've had him on the show. And just this importance of institutions are kind of the bedrock of society. And I think also there's a lot of evidence that they are integral to our happiness and our flourishing. But the distinction I want to make and get you all to respond to it is this idea of the reason that sort of institutions, one of the things that they offer is, Melinda, you keep talking about the sense of purpose, that I think part of purpose is an obligation. Because if nothing is ever expected of me in any sphere of life, that doesn't lend itself well to purpose, even if I think, well, I have maximum freedom to go do whatever I want. I think it's harder, just in my own view, to feel that sense of purpose, whereas now, like, there are expectations that Sutherland Institute has of me as an employee. There are expectations my wife and our two sons have of me. There are expectations that my faith community has of me. And so I think when we think in terms of civil institutions, if men, particularly young men, are increasingly retreating from family, faith groups, work, sort of these institutionalized forms of purpose, that seems to be at the heart of this. I could be wrong, but I just toss that out. What do you all think?
Yeah, at AIBM, we have done a lot of research and are still looking into what we're calling HEAL, HEAL, Health, Education, and Literacy, majors and careers. And I think that this ties very nicely into what you mentioned as far as having a purpose outside of yourself and a responsibility to your community. So by looking at a major in, let's say, nursing, you are pursuing a higher education degree. Then you are serving in your community. You are responsible for the care of others. And you also have an opportunity to move up in that career. There's a lot of economic mobility in nursing. But this has traditionally been coded as a female career. And as we're seeing opportunities for men in higher education to pursue untraditional paths or paths that may lead to a great outlook for themselves and their future families, we're encouraging them to look at those majors and careers in health, education, and literacy because they give that purpose and long-term economic sustainability.
Yeah, I really like how you said, Nic, a system of higher education. And I think that's really important because I think what we need to do is not fall into zero-sum thinking. I see this a lot where we either say, my son either goes to college or he'll just have to settle for trade school, right? We've seen that before. Or on the flip side, we hear people say, better to go to trade school than go to college and be brainwashed by blah, 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 blah. And that's all kind of zero-sum thinking, that for technical colleges to be great, universities have to not be great, and the vice versa. But a system of higher education would say that all of the above are important, particularly as maybe high school only jobs that were the backbone of maybe male vocations in the 50s and 60s. Even if we could snap our fingers and reshore every single one of those, automation is going to replace that. And so in the jobs of the future, we're going to have some human capital beyond high school. And so that means high school's got to rethink the way that they do things, because maybe they're going to have to do better vocational training there to give kids the opportunity to experience it. along with better college prep. But I like what you said about institutions. I'm also a big Yuval Levin fan, just finished his book on recommendation from folks back home. And so one of the things I do think that is interesting is right now higher education is kind of at a low point in people's faith in it. But when you go to like rural Tennessee, and if I'm wearing an orange Power t-shirt, boy, do I have friends everywhere I would go in rural Tennessee, right? Because they feel a big identity marker, even if they are not alumni of the University of Tennessee, because that represents something about their hometown and home state. Just like if I want to get in trouble on Twitter, I just log on and make a BYU versus Utah comment, and it will light up my mentions for the rest of the day. And so what I think, though, those institutions do give is they give us a sense of identity, and they give ourselves a sense of purpose. Now, you don't have to get it by being a college grad, but man, they sure do a great job, especially our public land grants, at rooting people into their local communities and giving them a sense of purpose, just like how we hate Alabama one weekend a year here in Knoxville, right? And that's kind of a healthy way to look at it, but it gives us that sense of identity.
Yeah, this connection, right? I mean, it's we are typically celebrating higher education for what it does for people in terms of access to social mobility, and that is important. But is that just the strictly economic mechanism, or is it partly this connection, this creation of connection, this participation in an institution that allows for thriving, which maybe also contributes? I mean, this kind of touches on like the questions about what does education do that actually delivers returns, right? And there's the signaling theory, which says like, you know, you only do well after college because you've proven that you can go through the steps of getting through a college degree. But you know, maybe this connection piece, this purpose piece, is sort of an under-celebrated aspect of higher education. And not to diminish what higher education is, but to say that this is a piece that, you know, as we see men retreating from all types of institutions, that this is maybe part of an additional layer of the problem here.
Yeah, there's something about letting young people kind of gather together, have an experience past high school that means you've transitioned to adulthood. And that's why, you know, universities serve many different roles. They serve for young people to meet each other and get married, family formation are also parts of higher ed, as well as learning how those soft skills and those developing ways to kind of function in society. I mean, one thing that I really enjoy in teaching undergraduates labor economics, because it's the boring, most sounding, exciting course on campus, is getting a lot of students in a classroom and debating healthcare policy and learning how to hear the one kid on the one side of the room say we need a Scandinavian socialist medical system, and another kid saying government should hands off everything in healthcare, discuss their points and learn to disagree in a collaborative way. That's one unique thing we hope to bring in our college campuses. We aren't always successful, but that could be another nice form of social capital, as you were alluding to, Beth.
Yeah, we have done some work around belonging on college campuses and have seen, especially for male students, there's three types of belonging that we're looking at. One is before you're on campus, do you see yourself fitting into that campus? Do you see yourself sitting in the bleachers or sitting in the classroom or hanging out with friends in your dorm playing video games? Can you visually imagine yourself there? Once you're on campus, we see both the social belonging with peers and then also academic belonging, like Mike just mentioned, with your faculty. And the faculty is who really leads that. And I've heard that he's done a really great job at this, of knowing your students' names, involving them in conversations, giving them a voice. And if a student only has that social belonging and they're missing the academic belonging, then their sense of purpose might waver. Same as if they only had the academic belonging, if only faculty members knew their names, but they had no social connection outside of the classroom, then again, they may not feel like they see themselves long-term on campus. Studies are showing that if you have a strong sense of connectedness, you are more likely to graduate from an institution. So this is an area we're going to continue to invest in.
Melinda, I know we don't have answers here. I mean, the institutions don't know what to do. I mean, we can't really put our finger on the problem. But, you know, as you build this collection of institutions who have concerns in this area, what are the things that are on the table?
Yeah, thank you. We have over 30 institutions. It's a very diverse group, both geographically and by type of institution, both public, private, 2-year, 4-year, large schools like Arizona State University and small schools like Umpqua Community College in Oregon. So they each bring something unique to how they're approaching the challenges that men are facing on their campuses. And what they're doing is taking a real campus-led approach. Many of the schools have built task forces to look at the data and say, where's our greatest area that we could improve? These task forces usually span the entire campus. They include both faculty, administrators, and sometimes even students. It's important that we have students involved in this conversation as well. They're doing things like building peer networks, so building on that social capital. And then also investing in larger institutions. So there's a brotherhood initiative at the University of Washington where they have an academic class or classes that Black males in their program are taking to learn more about the issues that they're facing on campus and opportunities for them to be leaders on campus and outside of campus as well.
In the few minutes we have left, I want to focus on solutions, and knowing that, as we've kind of articulated, it's still hard to sort of perfectly define the nature of what's going on. Hopefully that research will continue and everything, but I want to talk about what is being done and what should be done to try and help. Obviously, we're looking at it through the lens of higher ed and college specifically, but I think you both have articulated well that it's part of a broader system, that there are multiple pathways we want to support. And so I want to ask Melinda, the Higher Education Male Achievement Collaborative, any additional things you want to share about what you all are working on in this space, and then for everyone, like what kinds of things should we be thinking about as a country, as a state here in Utah? And then at the end, I'll kind of ask my elevator question of, if policymakers just pinged you and asked what to do, what should we do next? So start there, maybe, Melinda, with some of the things that you all are working on. What's promising? What's exciting to you about progress you're seeing that other people should be paying attention to?
Yes, thanks, Nic. I'm really excited about this group that we have brought together in HEMAC, and we are a growing program. So as other schools are interested in doing this work, we would love for them to partner with us and study what is happening on their campuses and across the program as a whole. To date, we are hosting monthly virtual events that cover a variety of different topics. One of our first topics was how to discuss men's issues on college campus and live to tell the tale. We know that this can easily become an ideological conversation, but as long as we look at the data and have a data-driven narrative, we want our students who are challenged to be most successful. So we are building frameworks within HEMAC that schools can use, toolkits, recordings of our virtual events, and we are also starting to form some working groups this summer and going into the fall that will be looking at specific topics, and each school will be doing their own individual research and collaborating on that research as well in preparation for our next partner convening, which will be in January. And we'll then share out some of the research that we find.
That's amazing to hear, and it seems like a lot has happened in a short time frame just in the last couple of years, so it's encouraging to see this progress. Mike, I'm curious what you think from the kinds of things that Melinda is doing with HEMAC, and then also just generally speaking, what, from your vantage point, having looked at the data in depth and being there on a college campus, teaching these folks directly, what kinds of things would you hope to happen in Tennessee and Utah, elsewhere in the country, to help address this?
Yeah, no, I think one of the interesting parts, like Melinda pointed out, organizations like HEMAC are super important because what they're doing is they're starting a conversation. Because when we look at the data, we see that there's a problem, and maybe the listeners might be a little bit dissatisfied or find it unsatisfying that I'm like, this is not the answer. But as a researcher, I think this is great because we pointed out a problem, we're not sure what the answer is, and now we can start that path of discovery. But one of the problems we have is just talking about the issue. And why that concerns me is that if we don't have data-driven, truth kind of centered, evidence-based discussions on this issue, then what will fill the gap are these things like the manosphere that folks have been talking about, or kind of these negative voices that try to turn us into a zero-sum game, that for men to succeed, women have to not succeed. Or for women to succeed, men have to not succeed. They need to get in the back of the bus, could we say. But what I find really fascinating by this discussion is we're not going to yield this debate to kind of the negative elements of the extremes, but rather what we want to do is find a way that humans can thrive together, and that each side of the gender gap can find the way and the pathway so they can achieve their life goals in a free society. And I think that by filling that missing gap and by giving people a positive sum way of viewing the world, I think that's going to be huge in and of itself. And that way, when policymakers kind of hopefully approach and say, what can we do in our campuses? What can we do in our states? There we're going to build something that's going to be productive for everyone in the community, as opposed to just certain groups of the community.
To finish off, I want to ask again this hypothetical kind of elevator question that if you're standing on an elevator and in walks Utah Governor Spencer Cox and a few folks from the state legislature leadership, and if they say, hey, we saw that podcast, you guys are great, what should we do? And if it's as pointed as, what's the one thing that we should do here in Utah in the year 2025, or if there's one bill the legislature were to run in 2026 to do something on this issue, does anything come to mind? What's the one big first step?
I think the big first step Governor Cox is doing a great job. I appreciate the work he's done for my home state. I think the one first big step is recognizing that most of the institutions, both in Tennessee and Utah, are not single-digit acceptance rates institutions. And why I think that's so important is that means that as we recruit bring all sorts of types of people to our campus community, it doesn't take away a spot from someone else. And so it can only expand the economic opportunities for folks. So one concrete step I would do is I would engage with try to nail down that connection with our high schools and our systems of higher education, so that when young folks get in transition, they are able to either transition to college, maybe try it out, decide they don't like it, then transition over to a technical school, or go to technical school, earn a certificate that can earn them the wages that they can be successful in a bachelor's degree. But making those pathways clear and making those pathways smooth. In behavioral economics, we talk about removing sludge. So any way that kind of blocks somebody from moving back and forth towards a goal, that is something that policymakers could work on, kind of taking away from the system, making it a more transparent, open, and connected system.
Melinda, what's the one big thing Utah should do right now?
Well, I think states as a whole could follow a similar model to what our campuses and HEMAC are following, taking a really deep dive into their data at a state level, and then seeing if there's an opportunity to build a task force that examines where there are opportunities or even greater challenges for men who are looking to enter higher ed.
Well, thank you both. We'll leave it there. Obviously, the conversation continues, the work continues, and we're very appreciative to everything you both are doing, both in Tennessee and around the country, to strengthen the post-high school economic prospects of men in this country. So I want to thank both of you for your time and expertise and being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks, Nic and Beth.
Thank you.
And once again, that was Mike Kofoed with the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, Haslam Business College, and Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research, and Melinda Brock with the American Institute for Boys and Men and the Higher Education Male Achievement Collaborative. A lot of titles to get through. And of course, Beth Akers, AEI Senior Fellow and contributor here at Defending Ideas. Thank you all. We're going to leave everyone with a quick break, followed by some talking points to round out this discussion. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. There's a common thread between this episode today and our earlier discussion with Nick Eberstadt on the retreat of men from the workforce, and is prompting a bigger question in my mind. Is there evidence that large numbers of men are pulling back from institutions of civil society, like work that we talked about before, education that we talked about today, and possibly other areas? Diving into this issue certainly can prompt some robust debate over politics, culture, and much more. So here's an approach that I think should help guide these discussions. First, we should not frame this as men versus women. It's not a zero-sum game or an equity battle that's just about leveling percentages. Rather, it's about understanding if large and increasing numbers of men no longer see as much value in a key institution of civil society, higher education, as they once did, and trying to understand why that's the case, and more importantly, if some men in our country feel a diminished sense of purpose in modern society today, broadly speaking, and what's causing that. That brings me to the second point. This broader effort is about increasing the numbers of men and boys who lead flourishing lives, full of vocational pursuits, good mental and physical health, and meaning derived from engaging in things like faith, family, work, and broader civil society. And lastly, we need to continue elevating our dialogue around post-high school opportunities by following an all-of-the-above approach. There are many pathways after high school that can provide empowering education followed by meaningful work. We just need to strengthen and promote all of those pathways. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or the friend, family member, or coworker who might find it interesting. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.